In this section, we're going to talk about lower body pulling, and we're going to go through some of the lower body pulling movements that we can execute in the weight room. If we recall back to our theory presentation, lower body pulling is either going to be dictated by one of the two major joints in the lower body performing the action. If the knee is fixed, then it's going to be a hip dominant movement because the hip is going to be executing the movement. If the hip is fixed, it's going to be a knee dominant pulling movement because the knee is executing the action. We can execute lower body pulling movements either with two legs or a single leg, and we're going to go through some of those right now. We're now going to go through our hip dominant pulls. The major movements that we use for our hip dominant pulls are the Romanian deadlift or the RDL. There are a number of ways that we can execute these RDLs. We can do it with two legs or a single leg. To demonstrate what the key cues and the key things that we're looking for in the RDL position, we'll start off with two legs, and Natalie will set up in that position. When she gets into the bottom position of her RDL, there are a couple of things that we're looking for. First thing, adequate knee bend. We want to make sure that she's got her knees bent so that we're activating the glutes and taking the hamstrings out of the primary equation. The straighter the knee is, when we go into hip extension, the hamstrings will want to turn on. So your stiff-legged deadlifts that we see in the weight room are for hamstrings. In this case, with the knees bent, we're going to activate the glutes. The second part, we want to make sure that the back is flat and that the torso is straight. We want to make sure that the shoulders are engaged. If the back is rounded, it's going to take the glutes off stretch. It's a common mistake that we see. So we always want to make sure that the back is flat and that the head is in a neutral position. If the head goes into too much extension, which usually happens when the person is trying to keep their torso upright or neutral, it's going to put a lot of load on the lower back. So we want to make sure that the torso and the head are in a neutral position, and as she comes up, she extends her hips all the way through. So as a movement, complete hip extension, we want to see knee flexion, we want to see a straight torso and her head in a neutral position. Now, we'll have Natalie perform the dumbbell RDL. So again, key points that we're looking for. Adequate knee bend, the torso is in neutral, and the head is in neutral. Natalie, start whenever you're ready. Once the person's moving now, we want to make sure that the weight shift is correct. A common mistake is that the person is going to shift their weight towards their heels. They're going to lean back as they perform this movement. What we want to make sure is that the weight is over the midfoot. So again, they're putting the pressure over the center of their foot, they're over their center of mass to make sure that we're loading the hips correctly. As we can see, Natalie shifts her weight, hip hinging, placing the weight over her midfoot, executing this movement the way that we want. Again, always taking note of the key points. Knees, hips, torso, and head. That's how we execute the dumbbell RDL. Another variation that we can do is a single arm, single leg dumbbell RDL. It is exactly like the two-leg RDL, very similar to our inverted hamstring and movement prep. Those are going to be the same key points that we're looking for, except now she has a dumbbell in her hand and there's going to be some resistance. This particular execution type is going to be a contralateral movement. It means that the resistance is in the opposite hand to the leg that is grounded. We can do an ipsilateral style movement, which means that the resistance would be in the same hand as the leg that's grounded, or we could do a two-arm single leg RDL. This contralateral movement is going to be executed just like the RDL, except we have a single leg. Natalie, again, will focus on flexing the knee, keeping the torso erect as she does this movement, and making sure that she keeps her head in neutral. Key point from our inverted hamstring is that we get length. We can see that from head to heel, we have a nice straight line. We have that plumb line or that posture that we want as she executes this movement, still hinging that hip. So again, when we get to that bottom position, the weight is over the midfoot. We don't want to sit back into that heel. This is how we execute the single arm, single leg dumbbell RDL. Now we're going to go through knee dominant pulls. If we recall from the theory presentation, a knee dominant pull is going to be where the hip is fixed and the knees are executing the action. The main movement that we're going to do is a hamstring curl, and we can utilize either a stability ball or a slide to execute this hamstring curl. In this case, we're going to utilize this stability ball. There are a couple of key points that we want to focus on when we do this hamstring curl. The first major landmark is going to be the ankles. The ankles are going to give us a lot of information. When we're looking at the ankles, there are a couple of things we want to make sure are happening. First, we want to make sure that the ankles are dorsiflexed. It's very common when people are pulling or doing a knee dominant curl for them to plantar flex. This plantar flexion means that they're going to take their gastroc out of the equation and put a lot of undue stress on the hamstrings. So in order to nullify that, we want to make sure the ankles are dorsiflexed. It's also very common that people are going to be tight in their hip flexors. The way that we notice that they're tight in their hip flexors is that they're going to externally rotate. We want to account for this external rotation or this hip flexor tightness by making sure that the feet are in neutral. The second main landmark and the third key cue that we want to be able to coach for, we're going to have to do once the person is in the top position of this eccentric curl. We're going to do 2 executions of this movement. We're going to do one eccentrically and we're going to do one concentrically. Eccentrically, to get to the top position, Natalie will curl the ball towards her and then she's going to extend her hips. This is going to be our third main coaching point. We want to make sure that Natalie is extending at the hip and not through her low back. The way that we can see that this is happening is there should be a clear plumb line from shoulder to hip to knee. If they're in a complete line, then we know that she's extending through her hip. If we start to see an arch, then we know that she's extending through her low back. Natalie will now extend her hips and get into the top position. We're going to see that she's got a line from shoulder, hip, and knee in this extended position. Now, she'll execute this eccentric curl by straightening her legs, pushing her heels away from her. She'll reset by her hips going back down. Now Natalie will execute this eccentric hamstring curl so that we can see that she's utilizing all of these key cues. We want to make sure that she's feeling this in her glutes and in her hamstrings. We want to make sure that she's not feeling this in her low back as she does this movement. For us to move into a progression, the progression will be executing a concentric hamstring curl. We can start off the way we started our eccentric hamstring curl. She can curl the ball towards her, she'll extend into her main position, and then she'll execute her eccentric hamstring curl. This time she will not lower her hips. Now we're in the starting position for her concentric curl, and now she'll execute a rapid extension of her hips and curl the ball underneath her, and then extend back out. This is how she would execute the concentric hamstring curl. Again, hips go up in the air, knees go under her rapidly, and out. Hips stay up in the air, hips go up rapidly, and out. This is how you execute the concentric hamstring curl. Now our progression from our hamstring curl is going to be our single leg hamstring curl. It's not only going to be a progression because we're going from 2 legs to 1 leg, but it's going to be a progression because we're now utilizing a slide. The slide is going to make this inherently more difficult because we're going to be closer to the ground, longer lever arm, a lot more stability is going to be required. The single leg setup is going to now also add a rotational element. So this is a really aggressive progression. We want to make sure that the person doing this is prepared to be able to execute this movement because there's a lot of force that they're going to have to be accounting for. The way that we do this is we're going to get set up on a slide. If you don't have a slide, you can use a towel, you can use a manila folder, anything that's going to slide on the floor that you have, whether it's a carpet or a hardwood floor. As you can see, same key points. Dorsiflexion at the ankle. We want to make sure that we're not externally rotated. And again, we want to make sure that we have that plumb line once we get to our top position. In order to execute this, we're going to do this concentrically this time. We're going to start off, or Natalie will, by pulling her left knee to her chest. She's going to keep her left knee in this position the entire time, also dorsiflexing that ankle the entire time. From here, she's going to be aggressive in lifting her hips and simultaneously sliding her heel underneath her while she extends to execute this curl. As she executes it, we want to make sure that she has that straight plumb line, extending those hips, driving those hips up nice and tall, pulling that slide underneath her while keeping her ankle dorsiflexed the entire time.